I always thought lies had a certain smell to them, faint, sour, almost metallic, the kind of thing you can sense before you can explain. Looking back now, I realized that smell had been lingering in my house for months, maybe even a year. I just didn't want to breathe deeply enough to recognize it. The morning everything changed started normally. I was at my desk at the airport maintenance hangar, half listening to the chatter of my co-workers while filling out a repair log for a CFM engine. My phone buzzed twice, a flight confirmation from the joint email account my wife, Lila Harrington, insisted we keep for emergencies only. At first, I didn't pay attention, but the subject line caught my eye. Your flight to St. Lucia, confirmed. St. Lucia, not Fiji, not the solo spiritual healing retreat she'd been planning for months. I remember freezing mid-sentence, my pen hovering above the form. For a full minute, all I heard was the whir of ventilation fans and the steady beat of my own pulse. I blinked at the screen, convinced I was misreading it. Lila had told me last night, with that tranquil, distant smile she'd perfected, that she was flying to Fiji. She'd made a whole show of packing white linen dresses and incense sticks, insisting she needed space to find herself. I'd believed her, even though I'd felt the invisible wall between us for weeks. But St. Lucia? Why? My stomach dropped. I opened the reservation. Passenger, Lila Harrington. Destination, Huonora International Airport, UVF. St. Lucia Hotel, Baystone Ocean Suites. Nothing made sense. She hated the Caribbean humidity. She'd once said she would never survive a day in St. Lucia because her hair would turn into a lion's mane. So why lie? I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my face with both hands. A quiet dread seeped into my veins, mixing with rising anger and something else. Recognition. Because deep down, I already knew this day was coming. The signs had been everywhere. The sudden weekend workshops, the locked phone, the spiritual retreats she insisted she needed for her brand, the secretive smiles she gave to messages she never explained, and the new expenses on our credit card, vague charges labeled consulting, wellness services, creative sessions. I had brushed them aside, told myself she was just stressed, just evolving, just reinventing herself like she always talked about. Lila changed identities the way most people changed clothes. It was exhausting, but I loved her. Or at least I loved the version of her I married. But the version staring back at me from that flight confirmation wasn't the woman I thought I knew. I couldn't ignore the truth any longer. That's when I did something I had never done in our 6 years of marriage. I went digging. I pulled up the airline manifest, something I technically wasn't supposed to do. But I had access, and I needed answers more than I needed rules. I scanned the list, line by line, heart thumping in my chest. There it was, Adrian Morel, a name I knew, a name I hated without fully understanding why. She had mentioned him months ago. Just a marketing consultant she met at a wellness conference in Toronto. I remembered her describing him as brilliant, visionary, magnetic. I remembered the way she said his name, like tasting something sweet and dangerous. Seeing his name on the passenger list felt like a punch to the ribs. My hands trembled as I opened my browser and typed his name into LinkedIn. And just like that, the world I knew dissolved. His profile was polished, full of buzzwords: entrepreneur, investor, holistic resort visionary. But what stopped me cold were the photos. There she was, Lila, in 3 different pictures, standing beside Adrian at conferences, smiling at a beachside dinner, posing at what looked like a construction site, her arm around his waist, his hand gripping her shoulder. But the worst part? The necklace she was wearing. A thin silver chain with a small meteorite pendant. The one I'd given her on our 3rd anniversary. The one she claimed she never took off because it reminded her of the gravity that keeps us together. Seeing Adrian touching it, touching her, it lit something inside me. Not just betrayal, fury, cold, sharpened fury. I slammed my laptop shut, then opened it again almost instantly. I couldn't stop. I checked our shared Find My iPhone setting. She had forgotten, or never bothered, to disable it. Her phone location pinged clearly. Castries, St. Lucia. Not even pretending to be near Fiji. Her bank account. Nearly empty. My savings? Drained. And then the final blow. A series of transfers over the last 6 months to an unknown offshore account. Each one labeled Project Investment. I stared at the numbers until my vision blurred. My wife wasn't just cheating. She was planning a new life. With him. Funded by me. And she thought I would never find out. But she underestimated the man she married. I sat there in the hangar, surrounded by the metallic scent of engine oil, and made a promise to myself. If she wanted to test our marriage, she was about to learn what real consequences looked like. And I was only just getting started. Once the initial shock settled into something colder and more bearable, I shifted into the version of myself I relied on during emergencies at the airport. Focused, methodical, detached enough to avoid emotional short-circuiting. I wasn't just a betrayed husband anymore. I was an investigator with a personal stake the size of a crater. And my first step was simple. Figure out exactly what Lila and Adrian were doing. I opened her laptop, the device she kept at home because it was too heavy to travel with. Her password was the same as always, the street number of her childhood home. She'd changed everything else about herself in the last few years. But not that. Not the simple code that still tied her to the person she used to be. Her mail app opened instantly, and what I saw inside made my stomach twist. There were dozens of threads between her and Adrian, messages dripping with strategic scheming, shared fantasies, business plans, and veiled insults about my supposed cluelessness. She had labeled the folder, Haven Planning, Private. I clicked it open. There were architectural sketches, projected profit margins, investor rosters, schedules for content rollout, even a branding package for a resort I had never heard of. Ocean Crest Haven, a sanctuary for the spiritual elite. The description made me snort aloud. Spiritual elite? These people didn't care about spirituality. They cared about money, influence, escapism, all wrapped in linen robes and filtered sunset photos. But the more I read, the deeper the dread sank. Because the documents weren't hypothetical visions, they were operational. Expected funding dates, construction timelines, investor contracts, a launch strategy, and then emails. Emails revealing exactly what Adrian's game was. He didn't want a resort. He wanted investor cash. Ocean Crest Haven was a scam, a front using stock photos, AI-generated images, and faked testimonials. And investors, 12 of them, had already contributed over $200,000, believing they were funding a genuine luxury eco-retreat. Those funds were sitting offshore, ready for disbursement, ready for Lila. My throat tightened. They had planned everything, the retreat, the divorce, the split of assets, the public narrative about my neglect and jealousy issues. A new life funded by stolen money, and the savings she'd siphoned from under my nose. And worst of all, she wasn't planning on telling me until the divorce papers were signed. Until she had everything. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen as the enormity of her betrayal crashed over me in slow, suffocating waves. This wasn't a simple affair. It was a conspiracy. And I was done being passive. I opened our shared calendar. She had scheduled her Fiji retreat to last 2 weeks, meaning I had just enough time to dismantle every lie she had ever built. So I started with the part of her identity she valued most, her social media presence. Lila's entire online persona was built on curated authenticity, sunrise yoga photos, meditative captions, aesthetic matcha bowls, all reinforcing her carefully crafted wellness guru image. She had thousands of followers, sponsors, brand deals, partnerships, contracts, and I had access to all of it. Her scheduler app was already open on her desktop. A week's worth of pre-planned posts lined up, tropical reflections about self-growth, perfectly timed sunsets, captions written to manipulate her followers into believing she was on a deep, spiritual journey. So I edited them, not maliciously, not cruelly, just truthfully enough to create doubt. I shifted timestamps, changed metadata, rescheduled posts at hours that made no sense for Fiji time, inserted subtle inconsistencies, duplicated skies, repeated outfits, filters that didn't match. Her followers were sharp. They noticed everything. And within a few hours, comments began pouring in. Why is the sun rising at 2 p.m. Fiji time? You posted this same photo last year from Miami. Are you okay? Something feels off about your content? Why does this look like a stock image? It was working. Her online world, the one that kept her ego inflated, was beginning to crack. Next came her business contacts. I drafted an email addressed to her sponsors, her partnerships, her brand managers, all written politely, professionally, and honestly. I explained that Lila was facing significant personal and legal complications that might disrupt upcoming campaigns, that I was apologizing in advance for delays, that we appreciated their patience. I didn't mention the affair or the scam. I didn't need to. The tone alone would send ripples. Her phone, still synced to our iCloud, buzzed nonstop. Brand managers panicking, sponsors asking for clarification, coordinators demanding new deadlines. Meanwhile, she posted on Instagram a photo of herself doing beach yoga with the caption, "Entering my transformation era. Don't question what you can't yet understand." The comment section turned into a bonfire. Then, as if fate wanted to hand me the final piece, I found the login credentials to Adrienne Morel's email, saved in a shared password vault she apparently forgot to clear. I logged in. The inbox was a gold mine. Investor emails, wire transfer screenshots, legal threats, construction photos, all staged, confidential spreadsheets. And the worst one? A draft contract naming Lila Harrington as the sole beneficiary of the offshore account once their partnership dissolved. They were going to take the money and disappear. Together. My heart hammered in my chest, but I wasn't shaking anymore. I was calm, focused, sharp. I gathered everything, every document, every screenshot, every financial trail, and backed it up on an encrypted drive. I wasn't going to confront her with shouting or tears. I was going to take everything she had built and turn it inside out. And then I booked a one-way flight to St. Lucia, using our joint credit card, the same card she had drained without hesitation. As I zipped up my carry-on bag, the house around me felt strangely quiet. The framed pictures of our wedding, the white rug she insisted on buying, the candles she lit during her manifestation nights, all of it suddenly felt hollow, as if the life we built had been staged from the beginning. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring at the living room, where we'd laughed, argued, made plans, made promises. Then I turned off the lights and walked out. If Lila thought she was leaving our marriage behind, she had no idea how far I was willing to follow her, not for revenge, but for justice. And I wasn't going to stop until the truth swallowed her whole. The plane descended into St. Lucia with a roar that rattled my chest and sent my thoughts spinning faster than the propellers. I stared out the window at the sparkling Caribbean waters, turquoise and endless, knowing that somewhere beneath that picturesque sun, Lila Harrington and Adrian Morel were laughing, scheming, believing themselves untouchable. I wasn't here to fight them physically. I was here to dismantle the entire illusion, piece by piece, in a way that left nothing but their own greed exposed. First, I had to confirm their location. The Find My iPhone app was mercilessly precise. Lila had checked in at Coral Bay Suites just 2 hours before. Adrian's movements mirrored hers. They were living the fantasy, cocktails at the private pool, sun hats and designer sunglasses, laughing at the thought of me tracing their every step. But I had something they didn't: time, preparation, and the truth. I checked into a small guest house a few miles from the resort, keeping my presence under the radar. No flashy car, no obvious luggage tags, just me, blending in as a tourist. I spent the first day watching them from a distance, taking notes, and photographing what I could without being noticed. Their routines were predictable: breakfast on the terrace, morning calls to potential investors, mid-morning swims, afternoons hidden in private meetings. And then I found the construction site, Ocean Crest Haven, or at least the facade of it. The half-built villas, rusted scaffolding, and cracked cement floors made the website's glossy images laughable. This was a shell, an illusion meant to fool naive investors into thinking progress was being made. I walked the grounds slowly, documenting everything. Each photograph and video would be irrefutable evidence when the time came to confront authorities and investors. At sunset, I returned to the suites, hiding behind the landscaping, just in time to overhear a conversation between Lila and Adrian. They weren't discussing romance or ambition. They were talking finances, logistics, and timing. Every word confirmed the scam. The offshore accounts, the fake contracts, the planned divorce settlement. It was all there, spoken aloud, like a confession they thought no one would hear. I pressed record on my phone, capturing the entire exchange. Every detail, every fraudulent plan, every casual lie. The betrayal was staggering, but strangely satisfying. That night, I made my move to involve the authorities. I called the local police station and asked for Detective Inspector Patricia Williams of the Royal St. Lucia Police. I explained calmly but firmly that I had evidence of financial fraud and theft involving multiple foreign investors. Within hours, she agreed to meet and examine the material I had collected. The next morning, Williams arrived at the guest house. I laid out the screenshots, emails, photographs, and recordings. She was meticulous, absorbing every detail. It wasn't long before she confirmed the severity. Lila and Adrian were about to face serious legal consequences. And then came the arrest. Coral Bay Suites at sunset. The perfect cinematic backdrop. Lila and Adrian were on the balcony, drinks in hand, laughing over their supposed brilliance. Police quietly surrounded the building. Williams signaled, and within moments, officers moved in. Adrian tried to flee, sprinting across the terrace, but was quickly apprehended. Lila froze, eyes wide, tears streaming down her face, realizing that all the plans she had meticulously laid out had collapsed in an instant. Handcuffed and escorted, she avoided my gaze initially, but when our eyes met, I saw it. The mask was gone. The smug, untouchable persona she had cultivated dissolved into raw fear. I didn't feel triumph or hatred. I felt clarity. Justice, finally. The fallout was immediate. News spread quickly. Lila Harrington and Adrian Morell charged with fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Investors were notified, and steps were taken to recover their funds. Her social media accounts were suspended, the website for Ocean Crest Haven seized. The empire she had built on lies evaporated overnight. And there I was, standing on the balcony after the arrests, watching her being led away. I remembered the woman I had married, real, flawed, loving, and mourned her briefly before realizing she no longer existed. The version of Lila who had schemed and betrayed had replaced her, and there was no going back. I contacted my lawyer and the investors, providing full testimony and evidence. Each document, screenshot, and recording added to the mountain of proof. Adrian faced the consequences of his complicity, and Lila was held fully accountable. In the quiet moments between the chaos, I allowed myself to breathe. For 6 long years I had tried to fix and protect, and I had been deceived at every turn. But now the deceit was exposed, the harm mitigated, and the path to my own recovery clearer than ever. I stayed in St. Lucia just long enough to ensure that authorities had everything they needed. And as I boarded the plane back home, I looked out over the ocean, the sun setting like a closing curtain on this chapter of my life. Lila's chapter, Adrian's chapter, the chapter of betrayal. And I was finally ready to start my own, one built on truth, resilience, and the knowledge that some people can never be fixed, only faced, and their actions held accountable. Returning home felt surreal, as if I had stepped into a world that had continued without me, oblivious to the storm I had just weathered. My apartment was quiet, almost sterile, a stark contrast to the chaos I had left behind in St. Lucia. Yet the silence was a relief, a chance to process everything that had happened and begin rebuilding my life from the ruins of betrayal. The first step was confronting the legal aftermath. Lila Harrington was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Adrian Morell received 7 years for orchestrating the scam. Investors recovered about 60% of their funds from frozen accounts and seized assets. Not a full restitution, but enough to feel that justice, however partial, had been served. Lila's social media empire, once glittering with followers and sponsorships, had evaporated. Her website's domain was sold, her accounts permanently blocked, and her influence in the wellness and lifestyle industry completely erased. I spent countless hours in consultation with attorneys, giving detailed testimony, and providing every piece of evidence I had gathered: screenshots, emails, recordings, financial statements. Each proof reinforced the narrative of betrayal and manipulation, and ensured that the authorities could act decisively. For the first time in years, I felt my voice mattered, that my experience could protect others from suffering the same fate. In the quiet moments, I reflected on Lila, the woman I had once loved. There had been a time when her laughter and presence filled the house with warmth and light, but that Lila no longer existed. She had been replaced by someone unrecognizable, driven by greed and deceit. I grieved, not for her, but for the life and trust that had been stolen from me, and I made a silent vow: never again. Life slowly resumed its rhythm. I returned to my work at the airport, repairing equipment and solving problems. The tangible, mechanical work grounded me, reminding me that some things could be fixed with skill and patience, unlike human deceit. The 6 years I had spent trying to fix Lila had taught me an invaluable lesson. People cannot be repaired like broken machinery. They must choose to change themselves, and some will always choose destruction over repair. Friends and family became my anchors. My brother David checked in regularly, making sure I wasn't consumed by bitterness. Colleagues noticed a new focus in me: quiet, deliberate, and self-assured. I allowed myself small pleasures again: early morning walks, strong coffee at my favorite cafe, listening to music without distraction. The normalcy felt almost foreign but wonderfully grounding. The psychological scars lingered. Trust had been broken, and rebuilding it, whether in myself or with anyone else, was a slow and careful process. I approached life differently now, with vigilance tempered by patience, with strength tempered by understanding. I had faced the worst, and I knew I could endure it. I also followed up meticulously to ensure accountability. Authorities had the evidence, but I checked that the repercussions were thorough. Every confirmation that justice was being implemented, each recovered dollar, each court hearing, brought a quiet sense of closure, like placing the final pieces of a shattered puzzle back together. Most importantly, I learned that revenge was not what healed me. The arrests, the court cases, and the exposure of Lila and Adrian were not acts of personal vindication, but the natural consequence of truth asserting itself. I had seen the betrayal, faced it, and survived. That survival was my own justice, and it required no theatrics. On quiet nights, I sometimes thought of Lila, not with love, but with awareness. I remembered glimpses of the woman she could have been, but I also remembered the manipulation and the lies. I accepted both memories, knowing that the chapter was closed. As months passed, life took on a new trajectory. I focused on work, personal growth, and meaningful relationships. I traveled occasionally, always ensuring transparency in arrangements and finances. I rebuilt my sense of security, judgment, and agency. The story of Lila Harrington became my quiet reminder, a testament to human fallibility and the resilience required to endure betrayal. In that story, I found not bitterness, but empowerment. I had witnessed deception, confronted it with strategy and calm, and emerged unbroken. I realized that some things cannot be fixed, only faced, understood, and left behind. Lila Harrington would remain in the past, a shadow of what once was. I moved forward, free from her manipulation, free to reclaim my life, and free to build a future based on truth and integrity. And so, life continued, not as it had been, but as it was meant to be, honest, self-directed, and unafraid. I had survived the storm, exposed the deceit, and emerged stronger. The woman I had loved might have vanished, but I remained. I had my clarity, my purpose, and the knowledge that some battles, when faced with patience and precision, could never be lost. Lila Harrington was no longer my problem. I finally understood that fully, and for the first time in years, I felt truly free.